I used to believe that betrayal had a sound, that it came crashing into your life like a storm you couldn't ignore. But what I learned was far more dangerous. It can be completely silent, slowly unraveling everything you've built without you even noticing until it's too late. And that's exactly what happened to me. Because for 8 years I believed I was in a strong marriage, a partnership built on trust, effort, and shared dreams. We weren't living some perfect fantasy life, but we were stable. We had plans, we had savings, we had a future we were carefully building step by step. And I trusted him in a way that made me blind to the warning signs, even when his behavior started changing, even when he began coming home late with excuses that didn't quite add up, even when he became overly protective of his phone, keeping it face down, taking calls in another room, smiling at messages he never shared with me. I convinced myself it was stress, that maybe I was overthinking. That relationships go through phases, and that love means trusting even when things feel slightly off. But deep down there was a quiet discomfort growing inside me, something I kept pushing away because facing it would mean risking everything I believed in. And then one ordinary evening, without any dramatic buildup, everything changed. He was in the shower. His phone buzzed on the table, and I wasn't even trying to snoop. I just glanced at the screen out of habit, but the message I saw didn't feel normal. It wasn't casual. It wasn't something you could ignore. There was intimacy in those words, a familiarity that didn't belong to me anymore. And before I could stop myself, I unlocked the phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled through messages that painted a picture I wasn't ready to see. It wasn't just an emotional affair. It was physical, planned, consistent, filled with lies that stretched back months, maybe longer. And then I noticed something even worse. Something that made my chest tighten in a way I had never felt before. Money, our money. The savings we had worked so hard to build together. Being spent on her, gifts, dinners, hotel bookings, things I had never received, things I didn't even know existed. And in that moment I didn't scream or cry, I just sat there frozen, staring at a life that no longer felt like mine, realizing that everything I trusted had been quietly taken away from me without a single warning. The days after that discovery felt unreal, like I was walking through a version of my life that didn't belong to me anymore. And when I finally confronted him, I expected denial. I expected him to fight for us, to at least pretend that what we had still mattered. But instead, he just stood there, calm, almost indifferent, as if the truth no longer required an explanation. And that silence hurt more than any confession ever could, because it confirmed what I had been afraid to admit. He had already checked out of our marriage long before I found out, and what followed wasn't just emotional devastation. It was a complete breakdown of everything I thought was secure, because once I started looking deeper into our finances, something I had never felt the need to question before, I uncovered a pattern that made my stomach drop. Transactions I didn't recognize, large withdrawals, luxury purchases, hotel bookings, expensive gifts, all tied to the same timeline as the affair. And with every detail I uncovered, the reality became harder to ignore. This wasn't just betrayal, this was calculated. This was ongoing, and this was something he had no intention of stopping. Weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and quiet breakdowns. I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. The person staring back looked exhausted, defeated, someone who had lost not just a relationship but a sense of identity, because it's not just about the money or the lies. It's about the trust that gets destroyed, the feeling of safety that disappears, the realization that the person you relied on the most was the one quietly tearing everything apart. And when our joint account finally reached a point where there was almost nothing left, it hit me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't something I could fix. This wasn't something I could recover from overnight. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was financially broken, emotionally drained, and completely alone in a situation I never saw coming. I remember the day everything shifted again because it didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt ordinary, almost forgettable. I was sitting alone in a small cafe, trying to figure out what my next step should be, staring at numbers on my phone that no longer made sense, thinking about how I was going to rebuild a life that had been taken apart piece by piece, when a man approached my table, and there was something about his presence that made me look up immediately. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't aggressive. He was calm in a way that felt intentional. And when he asked my name and I confirmed it, he sat down without hesitation, as if this moment had already been planned long before I arrived there. And then he said something that made everything around me feel distant, like the world had suddenly gone quiet. He said, "I think we have something in common." And before I could even process what that meant, he added, "I'm her husband." And for a second I couldn't breathe. Because in all the pain and anger I had been dealing with, I had never stopped to think about the fact that the woman involved in this wasn't alone either, that there was another life being affected, another person being deceived. And now he was sitting right in front of me, looking directly at me with a level of clarity I didn't have anymore. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know whether to feel ashamed, angry, or defensive, but he didn't give me time to react emotionally. Because he leaned forward slightly and said, "I know everything." And the way he said it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional. It was controlled, precise, like someone who had spent a long time preparing for this moment. And then he added something that changed everything. "And I think we can help each other." And in that moment, despite everything I had been through, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, curiosity mixed with a strange sense of possibility. At first, I didn't trust him. I didn't trust anyone anymore. But there was something about the way he spoke that made it hard to ignore what he was offering. Because unlike me, he wasn't reacting emotionally. He was thinking strategically. And as he started explaining what he knew, I realized just how much he had been paying attention. He had records, timelines, evidence of meetings, financial connections, even details I hadn't uncovered yet. And it became clear that while I was drowning in the emotional aftermath, he had been quietly building a case, watching everything unfold with patience and control. And then he said something that shifted the entire situation from personal betrayal to something much bigger. He said, "I own a legal firm." And suddenly this wasn't just about heartbreak anymore. This was about consequences, real ones, because he began explaining how what they had done wasn't just morally wrong. It had legal implications, misuse of joint funds, potential fraud, financial manipulation, things that could be challenged, things that could be fought. And as he laid everything out in a calm, calculated way, I started to see a path I hadn't considered before. Not just moving on, not just accepting the loss, but actually taking control of what had been taken from me. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I didn't feel completely powerless, because what he was offering wasn't just help. It was a plan, a way to turn something that had broken me into something that could be rebuilt on my terms. And even though part of me was scared of what this meant, of how far this could go, another part of me, the part that had been hurt and humiliated and left with nothing, knew that I couldn't just walk away without doing something. What followed wasn't immediate revenge or dramatic confrontation. It was something far more controlled, far more deliberate, because with his guidance, I started to gather everything I had ignored before, every transaction, every message, every detail that proved how deeply I had been wronged. And instead of reacting emotionally, I learned to think differently, to step back and see the situation as something that could be handled, something that could be challenged, and over time. The fear I had been living with started to turn into something else. Strength, not the loud, aggressive kind, but a quiet, steady determination to take back what was mine. And as the process unfolded, I realized that this wasn't just about money or betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my own life, because the person I was before all of this, the one who trusted blindly, who ignored warning signs, who believed everything would work out on its own, that version of me was gone. And in her place was someone who had seen the truth, who had faced it, and who had decided not to let it define her future. And while I won't pretend that everything was magically fixed, or that the pain disappeared overnight, what I can say is that I wasn't the same person sitting in that cafe anymore, lost and unsure of what to do next. Because now I had direction, I had clarity, and most importantly, I had the realization that even when everything is taken from you, even when you feel like you've hit the lowest point possible, there is still a way to rebuild, not by going back to what you had, but by creating something stronger, something that no one else can quietly take away from you again. The first step wasn't action, it was patience, something I had never been good at before, because when you're hurt, your instinct is to react immediately, to confront, to scream, to demand answers. But what I learned from him was that real control doesn't come from reacting. It comes from waiting, from observing, from letting the other person believe they're still in control while you quietly take it back. And so instead of exposing everything right away, I started doing something that felt strange at first. I watched, I documented, I paid attention to every detail that I had once ignored, every small inconsistency, every unexplained expense, every message that revealed more than it was supposed to. And slowly, piece by piece, a complete picture started forming. One that was far more damaging than I initially realized, because it wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about a pattern of manipulation, of calculated choices made over time. And what made it worse was how easily they both thought they could get away with it, how confidently they moved through their lives believing there would be no consequences. And during this time, I had to pretend, I had to act like I was still broken, still unaware, still someone who had accepted what happened. And that was the hardest part, sitting across from someone who had destroyed my trust, listening to him speak like nothing had changed, watching him live comfortably off the damage he had caused, while inside, I was building something he couldn't see, something that would eventually change everything. And the more I gathered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about recovering what I lost. It was about making sure they could never do this again, not to me, not to anyone. There came a moment when everything shifted from preparation to execution, and it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and precise. Because by that point, we had everything we needed, every transaction traced, every connection documented, every lie backed by evidence that couldn't be denied. And when the legal notices were finally prepared, I remember holding those papers in my hands and realizing how far I had come from the person who once sat helplessly staring at a broken reality. Because now, instead of confusion and fear, I felt clarity. I knew exactly what was happening, what would happen next, and what I wanted out of it. And when those notices were delivered, not just to him but to her as well, The reaction was exactly what you would expect from people who never thought they would be held accountable: panic, denial. Anger, sudden attempts to explain things that had already been proven. Messages started coming in. Calls I ignored. Apologies that felt empty. Excuses that sounded desperate. But what stood out the most was how quickly their confidence disappeared. How the same people who once acted without fear were now scrambling to protect themselves. And for the first time, I wasn't the one reacting to their actions. They were reacting to mine. And that shift in power, that moment where everything changed direction, was something I will never forget, because it wasn't just satisfying, it was freeing. But the real turning point wasn't just the legal pressure or the fear they started showing. It was the realization that I no longer needed closure from him. Because for a long time, I believed I needed answers. I needed him to explain why, to justify his choices, to give me something that would make sense of everything that happened. But as the process moved forward, I understood something much deeper. Closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you. It comes from the moment you stop needing anything from them at all. And that shift changed everything about how I saw the situation. Because suddenly, it wasn't about proving anything to him. It wasn't about making him understand what he did. It was about reclaiming my own sense of control, my own direction, my own future. And as negotiations began, as discussions around compensation, accountability, and consequences took place, I found myself sitting in rooms where I wasn't the victim anymore. I was someone who knew exactly what she wanted, someone who wasn't willing to settle for less. And that confidence didn't come from anger. It came from clarity, from understanding that what happened to me didn't define me, but how I responded to it absolutely would. And in those moments, I realized that the strongest form of revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. The outcome wasn't instant, and it wasn't simple, but it was real, because over time, the pressure we applied started to break through their defenses. Agreements were made. Accountability was forced. And while I won't go into every detail of how everything was resolved, what I can say is that I didn't walk away empty-handed. Not anymore. Because what was taken from me was acknowledged, challenged, and to a significant extent restored, but more importantly than that, what I gained in the process was something I never had before: a level of awareness, strength, and independence that no one could take from me again. And when I finally saw him again, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in a situation where everything was already decided, there was nothing left to say, because the person standing in front of him was not the same person he had once underestimated. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before: uncertainty. Maybe even regret. But by then, it didn't matter anymore, because I wasn't there for his reaction. I wasn't there for his apology. I was there for myself, for the version of me who had been broken and had managed to rebuild something stronger in its place. Looking back, I don't see this as the moment my life was destroyed. I see it as the moment everything I thought was stable was tested. And while it did break me for a time, it also forced me to become someone I might never have become otherwise. Someone who doesn't ignore warning signs. Someone who doesn't depend entirely on someone else for stability. Someone who understands that trust is important but awareness is essential. And even though the pain, the betrayal, and the loss were very real, they were not the end of my story. They were just the beginning of a different chapter. One where I chose not to stay silent, not to accept what happened as something I deserved, but to stand up, to take control, and to rebuild on my own terms. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, It's that the worst situations don't always come to destroy you. Sometimes they come to reveal exactly how strong you can become when you stop waiting for someone else to fix what they broke and start creating something better for yourself. Because in the end, what they took from me wasn't everything, and what I built after that was something they could never touch again. There was a time when I believed that once everything was resolved, once the legal battles were over and the truth had been exposed, I would finally feel at peace. But what I didn't expect was how quiet everything would become afterward. Because when chaos leaves your life, it doesn't immediately get replaced with happiness. It leaves behind a space, an emptiness that you have to learn to fill on your own. And in those quiet moments, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, not with anger, not with pain, but with a strange sense of distance, like I was looking at a story that no longer belonged to me. And that shift was powerful, because for the first time, I wasn't defined by what I had lost. I was defined by what I had survived. And slowly, I started rebuilding my life in ways that had nothing to do with my past, new routines, new goals, new ways of thinking. I stopped looking for validation from people who had already shown me who they were, and instead, I focused on becoming someone I could rely on, someone who wouldn't ignore her own instincts, someone who wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. And that process wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And every small step forward felt like proof that I was no longer stuck in the same place where everything had fallen apart. What surprised me the most was how differently I started seeing relationships after everything I had been through. Because before, I believed trust meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, no matter what, believing in them even when things didn't feel right. But now I understood that trust without awareness is just vulnerability waiting to be taken advantage of. And that realization changed the way I interacted with people. Not in a negative way, not in a way that made me closed off or bitter, but in a way that made me more conscious, more aware of the patterns I once ignored, the small signs that reveal bigger truths. And as time passed, I found myself becoming stronger in ways I didn't expect, not just emotionally, but mentally, because I was no longer afraid of being alone. I was no longer dependent on someone else for stability. I had learned how to stand on my own, how to make decisions without second-guessing myself, how to trust my instincts instead of dismissing them. And that confidence didn't come from winning a case or recovering money. It came from understanding my own worth, something I had unknowingly handed over to someone else before. And now that I had taken it back, I wasn't willing to lose it again. There were moments, of course, when memories came back, when something small would remind me of what I had gone through. A place, a song, even a simple conversation. And for a second, I would feel that familiar heaviness, that reminder of how everything once felt. But those moments didn't control me anymore. They didn't define my present, because I had reached a point where I could acknowledge the past without being pulled back into it. And that kind of emotional freedom is something you don't truly understand until you experience it. Because it's not about forgetting. It's about not being affected in the same way anymore. It's about knowing that what happened to you was real, it mattered, it hurt. But it no longer has power over who you are today. And that realization was one of the most important parts of my journey, because it meant that I had truly moved forward, not just physically, not just financially, but emotionally. And once you reach that point, you start to see life differently. You stop holding on to things that no longer serve you. You stop carrying weight that isn't yours to carry anymore. The last time I heard about them, It wasn't through confrontation or direct contact. It was through someone else, a casual mention, a passing update that didn't feel important anymore. And that moment made me realize just how far I had come, because there was a time when even the thought of them would trigger something inside me, anger, pain, frustration. But now it felt distant, irrelevant. Like hearing about strangers whose lives no longer intersected with mine. And that was the true closure I never knew I needed. Not an apology, not an explanation, but indifference, the kind that only comes when you fully let go. And that doesn't mean what happened didn't matter. It means that it no longer controls your emotions. It no longer holds any space in your present. And as I continued building my life, focusing on my own growth, my own goals, I realized that the biggest victory wasn't what I had recovered or what I had proven. It was the fact that I had moved on without carrying bitterness, without letting the past define my future. And that kind of peace is something no one can give you. You have to create it for yourself. If I could go back and talk to the version of myself who was sitting there that night, staring at those messages, feeling like her entire world was collapsing, I wouldn't tell her that everything would be okay right away, because it wouldn't be. I wouldn't tell her that the pain would disappear quickly, because it wouldn't. But I would tell her something much more important. I would tell her that she's stronger than she thinks, that even though it feels like everything is being taken away from her, there's something inside her that can't be touched, something that will carry her through everything that's about to happen, and that one day, she will look back at this moment not as the end of her story, but as the turning point that changed everything, because sometimes the worst experiences don't break you. They rebuild you into someone who sees the world more clearly, who understands herself more deeply, and who knows exactly what she deserves. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, something I would want anyone hearing this story to understand, it's that being betrayed doesn't make you weak. Losing something doesn't make you less valuable, and starting over doesn't mean you failed. It means you had the courage to walk away from something that was no longer right for you. Because life doesn't always go the way you plan. People don't always turn out to be who you believed they were. But that doesn't mean your story ends there. It just means you have a choice to stay stuck in what happened, or to take everything you've learned and build something better, something stronger, something that belongs entirely to you. And while I didn't choose what happened to me, I did choose what came next. And that choice is what changed everything. Because in the end, they didn't take my life from me. They forced me to rebuild it. And what I created after that was something far more powerful than anything I had before.